The frost on the churchyard grass had not yet melted when Sarah Whitfield turned her back on Michael's fresh grave and began the long walk home. The pine box had been closed for the funeral because the mill wheel had not left much of him for the neighbors to see. Reverend Halsey had spoken briefly and gently, and the women of Willow Creek had brought bread and salt pork wrapped in cloth, and by 2 in the afternoon the last wagon had rattled away down the frozen road, leaving her alone with 2 children and a silence that seemed thicker than the October wind. Her daughter Ruth was 4 years old and clutched a rag doll against her coat. Her son Thomas was 9 and walked a step ahead of them both, as if he understood already that someone had to lead. Neither child spoke. Sarah did not trust herself to speak either. She only walked, and the frozen ruts of the road cracked beneath her boots, and above them the first flurries of the season drifted down out of a low iron sky. The cabin waited for them at the end of a rutted lane, half a mile from the last neighbor. Michael had built it himself the summer they married, 12 years ago, when he was young and strong and full of promises about the porch he would add, and the second bedroom he would frame, and the good tight kitchen he would finish before the Bobbies came. He had finished none of those things. He had built the walls of green cottonwood boards that had shrunk as they dried, and the gaps between them had widened winter by winter, until you could see daylight through the seams beside the hearth. He had promised to fix it. He had always promised. Sarah pushed open the door, and the cold inside was almost the same as the cold outside. She stood in the doorway for a moment, holding Ruth against her hip, and looked at the room the way a stranger might look at it. A packed earth floor, a hearth built too small for the size of the cabin, a cast-iron kettle on a hook, 2 straw ticks on a rope bed frame in the corner, Michael's rifle above the door and his winter coat on a peg beside it, and his boots, still muddy, standing beside the doorway where he had left them the morning of the accident. The savings tin sat on the shelf above the hearth. She lifted it down and sat at the table and did not open it for a long while. When she finally did, she counted the coins twice. $9.83. That was what remained of everything Michael had ever earned. A new cast-iron stove would have cost $16 at Halloran's Mercantile, and a stovepipe another $2, and even then a stove could not do its work if the walls themselves refused to hold the heat. She had watched the wood pile last winter shrink faster than the snow outside, and Michael had cursed the wind that came through the seams and had promised, again, to fix them in the spring. She set the coins in a small stack on the table and looked at Thomas, who was feeding a splinter of pine into the fire, and at Ruth, who had fallen asleep on the bench with her doll clutched under her chin. Outside, the wind rose and pressed against the boards, and a thin whistling sound came through the wall behind her, cold as a finger drawn across the back of her neck. She would need another plan, and she would need it before the snow came. The letter she remembered was in the tin box beneath the bed. Sarah waited until the children slept before she pulled it out. Michael had kept everything in that box: the deed to the cabin, a photograph of his mother taken in Ohio before the war, a packet of seed corn wrapped in oilcloth, and at the bottom, tied with a piece of brown string, a small bundle of letters written in the careful, slanted hand of his cousin Hans, who had gone west with the German settlers and taken up a piece of ground in the Nebraska sandhills. She untied the string and spread the letters on the table beside the lamp. Michael had read them to her, some of them, in the evenings when the work was done, and she remembered laughing at Hans's descriptions of the wind out there, how it never stopped, how a man could lose his hat in April and find it again in July 3 counties east. But there was one letter she remembered for a different reason. It had come the winter Thomas was born, and Michael had folded it carefully back into the string and had said, half to himself, that he ought to try it someday if the price of lumber kept rising. She found the letter halfway down the bundle. The paper had yellowed a little at the folds. Hans had written in his slow, deliberate English, and the ink had faded to the color of weak tea, but the words were still clear enough by lamplight. "We have built our house of straw," the letter said. "You will laugh when I tell you so, but I ask you not to laugh until you have felt the walls. We stack the bales upon the sill like courses of stone, and we pin them through with stakes of green willow, and we cover them inside and out with a plaster of clay and sand and cut grass. The wall is 3 feet thick when it is finished. The wind cannot find its way through such a wall. In January, the stove is small and the room is warm, and we sleep without waking to the cold. My neighbor Klaus built the same, and so did the Vogel family. We learned it from an old man in the Sandhills who had learned it from a Russian, and he from his father, and so it goes back farther than any of us can say. There was more. Hans had drawn a rough diagram in the margin, a cross-section of a wall showing the layers, with arrows and little notes in German that Sarah could not read. But the diagram itself was clear enough. Straw stacked flat. Stakes driven down through the layers. Lath and plaster on either side. A skirt of stone at the base to keep the damp away. Sarah read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and set it beside the lamp and looked across the table at the 2 ticks where her children slept beneath a single wool blanket, and she thought about what Hans had written, and what the winter would bring, and what $9.83 could and could not buy. 30 bales of straw at the German settlement in the next valley would cost her, she guessed, perhaps $6 if she offered a fair price and hauled them herself. That would leave her enough for flour and lard and a small sack of dried beans, and perhaps a spool of stout thread and a paper of needles for the lath work. It would not leave her enough for a stove. It would not leave her enough for a mistake. She blew out the lamp and sat in the dark for a long while, listening to the wind. The German settlement lay 11 miles south, across a low pass the local men called the Notch, and Sarah set out for it before first light on a Tuesday morning with Thomas beside her on the wagon seat and Ruth wrapped in a shawl between them. The mule was old and slow and had been Michael's pride for reasons no one had ever quite understood, and it took them until nearly noon to crest the Notch and look down into the valley where the settlers had cleared their fields and raised their tidy square houses in a cluster around a whitewashed church. The man she was directed to was named Otto Brenner, and he came out of his barn wiping his hands on a rag and listened to her request without any change of expression. She had rehearsed the words the whole way down the pass. 30 bales, dry and tight, delivered nothing, hauled by herself. She named her price. He did not answer at first. He looked at the mule and at the wagon and at the 2 children on the seat, and then he looked at her, and something in his face softened by a degree that another woman might have missed. He asked her, in careful English shaded by his native tongue, what she meant to do with so much straw. She told him. She told him about the letter and about Hans and about the cousin in the Sandhills, and she watched his eyes as she spoke, and she saw the moment when he understood that she was not confused and not desperate in the way he had first supposed, but had come to him with a specific plan and a specific need. He nodded once when she finished. Then he walked her back to the stack behind his barn and pulled a bale down and cut the twine with his pocket knife and pushed his hand deep into the straw past the wrist and told her to feel it. She did. The straw was dense and dry and springy, and it smelled of summer sun and something faintly sweet like clover left in the barn too long. "This is good straw," he said. "Rye straw, long stems. The mice do not like it so well as oat straw. It will hold." He loaded the bales himself with his 2 grown sons, and he tied them down with rope of his own furnishing, and when Sarah counted out the $6 into his palm, he pushed one of the coins back to her and said something quiet in German to his older boy, who nodded and disappeared into the house. He came back a few minutes later with a small crock wrapped in cloth. "Butter," Otto said, "for the children. My wife sends it." Sarah did not trust her voice to thank him properly. She nodded, and she took the crock, and she climbed onto the wagon seat, and Thomas took the reins because her hands were shaking. They came back over the Notch at dusk with 30 bales of straw stacked high above the sideboards and the mule blowing hard on the upgrades, and it was full dark by the time they turned into the lane. The wagon groaned. The straw bales rustled softly with each jolt of the wheels. And somewhere between the pass and the cabin, Sarah understood that she had passed a point she could not walk back from. The savings were gone. The straw was in the wagon. Whatever happened now would happen because of what she had chosen. Ruth stirred against her shoulder and asked, in a small, sleepy voice, whether they were home yet. Sarah kissed the top of her head and said that they almost were. The first man to see the straw was Elias Halloran, who owned the mercantile at the crossroads and who had watched Sarah's wagon pass his front window on the way home that Tuesday evening. He came out onto his porch with his hands in his apron pockets and stood there for a long moment, and by Wednesday morning the whole town knew that the widow Whitfield had spent her last dollar on hay. Halloran was not a cruel man, or he did not believe himself to be one, but he loved a story the way some men love whiskey, and this one poured out of him easily. By noon he had told it to every customer who came through the door, and each telling improved a little upon the last. The widow had lost her senses. The widow was going to bed her children down in a manger like Christmas cattle. The widow had been swindled by the Germans, who had sold her spoiled feed and a crock of rancid butter to seal the bargain. The men who leaned against his counter drinking coffee laughed and shook their heads and said what a shame it was, and then they went home and told their wives, and by Thursday evening the story had reached the schoolhouse and the tavern and the parlor of every house in Willow Creek. Sarah heard none of it directly, because she did not go into town. She had begun her work the morning after the wagon returned, and she worked from the first gray light until the lamp guttered at night, and she had no time for the mercantile or for anyone in it. She had started with the north wall. She had taken Michael's hammer and his pry bar from the shed behind the cabin, and she had shown Thomas how to catch the boards as she loosened them so that the nails would not tear the wood. The interior planking came down in strips as long as she was tall, and each strip revealed the hollow cavity between the outer boards and the inner sheathing, dark and dusty and full of old spider silk. Michael had left those cavities empty. He had meant to fill them with sawdust, he had said once, when he could afford to buy it from the mill. He had never afforded it. She filled them with straw instead. She pulled the bales apart by the handful and packed the straw into the cavity as tight as her hands could press it, working from the sill upward, tamping each layer down with the flat of a board before she added the next. Thomas passed the straw to her, and Ruth sat on the floor with the rag doll and watched, and now and then Sarah stopped to blow the chaff out of her eyes and to work the ache out of her shoulders. The dust got into everything. It got into her hair and her collar and her supper. By the end of the first day the north wall was half filled, and by the end of the second day it was done, and she had nailed the interior planks back into place with the same nails she had drawn out, straightening each one against the hearthstone before she drove it home. She stood back and looked at the finished wall. From the outside, and even from the inside, nothing had changed. The cabin looked exactly as it had always looked. Only the sound was different. When she rapped her knuckles against the plank, the wall answered with a dull, dense note, like the sound of a full-grain sack, and no longer with the hollow drum it had made before. She smiled for the first time in a month. Then she moved to the east wall and began again. The men at Corrigan's Tavern took up the story on Friday night, and it was there that the jokes turned sharper. Corrigan poured whiskey by the ladle from a stoneware jug, and the room was small and low-ceilinged and blue with pipe smoke, and after the second round the talk always slid toward whoever was not present to defend themselves. This week it was Sarah. Halloran had been in earlier and had told the story again, with new embellishments, and by the time the mill hands arrived after their shift, the widow Whitfield had become a figure of settled comedy, a woman who had gone soft in the head with grief and was building herself a bird's nest to winter in. "She'll cook them," one of the men said. "Mark me. She'll bank a fire against that straw, and by January she'll have roasted her own bobbies like partridges in a pan." The laughter that followed was the ugly the kind men laugh when they are not quite certain they should be laughing, and it went on longer than the joke deserved. Another man said that a single spark from the hearth would take the whole cabin at once, and the widow would go up with it, and a third said that would be a mercy, considering. More whiskey was poured. The stove in the corner ticked and settled. Charlotte Aldridge's husband was there that night, sitting near the back with his hat pushed low, and he did not join in the laughter, but he did not stop it either. He came home late and told Charlotte what he had heard, and Charlotte, who was the schoolmistress and who had known Sarah since they were girls together in the same one-room school 10 miles east, set down her mending and said that it was not right for grown men to speak so of a woman who had just buried her husband. But she said it without heat, and when her husband shrugged and went to bed, she picked the mending up again and thought about the last time she had seen Sarah, at the funeral, and how thin she had looked, and how Ruth had clung to her skirt. The next morning Charlotte walked to the mercantile for a spool of thread, and Halloran told her the story before she had finished pulling off her gloves. Charlotte listened without interrupting. When he had finished, she asked him whether he had actually seen the straw, or whether he was only repeating what other men had said. Halloran looked surprised at the question. He said that his own eyes had seen the wagon go by, piled higher than the sideboards, and if that was not proof enough of a woman's foolishness, he did not know what would be. Charlotte paid for her thread and left. She meant, walking home, to go out to the Whitfield place that very afternoon and speak with Sarah, plainly and as a friend, and perhaps offer whatever small help she could. But her own boy Peter was down with a cough that week, and the schoolhouse needed sweeping before Monday, and by Saturday evening she had not gone. By Sunday she had, in the small, ungenerous way of people who know they ought to have done a thing and did not, begun to resent Sarah a little for making her feel guilty about it. At the church door that Sunday, when the Reverend's wife murmured something about the widow and the straw and the poor motherless children, Charlotte laughed. It was a short laugh, quickly stifled, but she laughed. And later she would remember that she had, and it would stay with her longer than anything else about that autumn. October gave way to November, and Sarah kept working. The east wall took her 4 days, because she had to move the bed and the small pine chest that had been her mother's, and there was less room to swing the hammer. The south wall took longer still, because the hearth stood against it, and she could not simply pry the planks off without risking the chimney breast. She solved that by leaving a narrow column of the original wall intact on either side of the hearthstone, and packing straw only into the sections above and beside them. And Thomas held the lantern for her while she worked in the tight spaces because the days had grown short, and the light failed by 4 in the afternoon. The west wall was the last. By then it was the middle of November and the first hard freeze had come and gone, and Sarah worked in her coat with her fingers wrapped in strips of flannel because the hammer head was cold enough to burn the skin. She finished the last course on a Saturday afternoon, drove the last nail, and stepped back into the middle of the room and turned slowly in place, looking at what she had done. The cabin looked, from the inside, almost exactly as it had before. The same rough plank walls, the same low ceiling, the same hearth and the same table and the same 2 straw ticks on the rope bed. Only the sound had changed and the feel of the air. When the wind came up outside, as it did that evening, the whistling that had always slipped through the seams was gone. The lamp flame stood still on its wick. The corners of the room, which had always been the coldest places, were no colder now than the middle. She laid her palm flat against the wall beside the hearth and felt only the faint warmth of the plank itself, and no draft moving behind it at all. She had used 26 of the 30 bales. The remaining 4 she stacked in the shed behind the cabin against the possibility that a section might settle over the winter and need repacking. She swept the last of the chaff from the floor. She washed her hair in a basin of heated water and combed the dust out of it, and she sat by the fire that night with Ruth on her lap and read to Thomas from the family Bible. And the small hearth fire, no larger than the one they had always burned, seemed to reach farther into the room than it ever had before. The next morning she took her thermometer down from its nail beside the door. Michael had bought it in Kansas City the year Ruth was born, a small brass instrument with a glass tube, and he had kept it on the wall for the pleasure of reading it each morning. She had never paid it much attention while he was alive. Now she watched it the way a farmer watches the sky. The temperature outside stood at 18. Inside, with only the banked coals of the night's fire, the thermometer read 54. She stared at it for a long moment. Then she added a single small log to the hearth and went about her morning, and by noon the reading inside had climbed to 62, and by evening, with the same log still burning low, it held at 60. She did not know whether this was remarkable. She had no other cabin to compare it to. But she remembered, from the last winter Michael had been alive, that they had burned through nearly 2 full cords of wood before Christmas, and she looked now at her woodpile and understood that this winter she would burn less than half of that. The blizzard came on the 11th of January. The sky had been low and yellow all that Wednesday, and the wind had shifted around to the north by mid-morning. And by noon, the older men at Halloran's Mercantile were standing on the porch and looking at the horizon with the careful, unhurried attention that men in that country reserved for weather they did not like the look of. The barometer in Halloran's back office had been falling since Tuesday evening. The stock troughs were skimmed with ice by 10. A rider came in from the north claiming he had passed through snow so thick above the notch that he could not see his horse's ears, and he did not stop for coffee, but only warmed his hands at the stove for 5 minutes and mounted again, and rode on toward his own place with his coat collar pulled up around his jaw. The first flakes reached Willow Creek at 2:30. By 4, the storm was on them in earnest. By 6, the wind was strong enough to lay a grown man flat if he did not lean into it, and the temperature, which had stood at 12 above zero at noon, had fallen through zero and kept falling. The schoolmistress Charlotte Aldridge dismissed her students at 3, an hour early, and stood in the schoolhouse doorway watching them scatter toward their homes, and she called after them to run and not to stop for anything. And she watched until the last small figure had disappeared into the white before she turned back inside and began to bank the stove. Her own son Peter was not among them. Peter had been kept home that morning with the cough that had lingered since November, and Charlotte had left him with a neighbor woman 2 doors down from the schoolhouse, a widow named Mrs. Doyle who took in children for a few pennies a day. Charlotte had planned to collect him at 4, walk him the 1.5 miles home, and be at her own hearth by 5 with the supper on. That plan had been made under a different sky. The temperature at sundown stood at 11 below. By 8 in the evening it was 20 below and still falling. The wind rose to a scream that pressed against the schoolhouse walls until the whole building groaned, and Charlotte, who had banked the stove and eaten a piece of bread standing at the window, understood that she was not going to make it home that night. She would sleep on the bench by the stove and wait for morning. Peter would sleep at Mrs. Doyle's. It was not what she had wanted, but it was the sensible thing. Then, around 9 o'clock, the schoolhouse door rattled and a man's voice shouted her name. It was Mr. Doyle's nephew, a boy of 16, and he had run the whole quarter-mile from his aunt's house with a scarf tied across his face and ice in his eyebrows. His aunt's stovepipe had come loose in the wind, he said, and the stove had smoked so badly they had been forced to put it out, and the house was going cold fast, and Peter was there and would not stop coughing, and Mrs. Doyle had sent him to fetch Charlotte because she did not know what else to do. Charlotte did not remember afterward what she said. She only remembered pulling on her coat and her boots and wrapping her muffler twice around her face, and stepping out into the storm, and the cold hitting her like a physical blow that drove the breath out of her lungs and made her stagger against the doorframe before she could catch herself and lean forward into the wind. She reached the Doyle house and found it worse than the boy had said. The parlor stove stood cold and black, and the air inside was already colder than any house should ever be, and Mrs. Doyle sat in her rocking chair with 2 quilts around her shoulders and Peter on her lap wrapped in a third, and the boy's face was gray, and his lips had a bluish cast that Charlotte had seen only once before, on a child who had not lived through the night. They could not stay. That much was clear within a minute of Charlotte crossing the threshold. Mrs. Doyle's nephew had already tried to relight the stove, and had given it up because the wind at the chimney top was too strong to draw. The other rooms of the house were colder still. There was no wood split small enough for the kitchen range, and the woodpile itself lay under a drift already knee-deep against the back door. The nearest houses on the town road were the Bergstroms and the Elises, and Charlotte knew both were framed and unfinished in the way that most of Willow Creek's newer houses were framed and unfinished, with plank walls and no packing between the studs, and she doubted that either family was faring much better than the Doyles this night. The parsonage was farther still and had the same construction. She stood in the middle of the parlor with Peter in her arms, and she tried to think, and the wind outside made a sound against the eaves that she had never heard a wind make before, a long, steady howl like something living that had been hurt. The Whitfield place was 2 miles out the north lane. The thought arrived unbidden, and Charlotte pushed it away at first, because 2 miles in this weather with a sick child in her arms was more than a woman could reasonably ask of her own body, and because of the other reason that she did not want to look at directly. But it came back, and it came back again, and finally she said it aloud to Mrs. Doyle. The straw cabin, the widow Whitfield's. It was closer than anything on the town road, and it faced south, and the north lane ran mostly behind the ridge that would break the worst of the wind. Mrs. Doyle looked at her a long moment, and then she said, in a small voice, that she did not think Sarah Whitfield would turn them away. She said it as if she were trying to convince herself. Charlotte wrapped Peter inside her own coat, against her body, with his head tucked beneath her chin, and she buttoned the coat over him so that only the crown of his cap showed. She took a lantern from the hook by the door. Mrs. Doyle's nephew offered to come with her, and Charlotte told him no, that he was to stay with his aunt and keep her walking around the room and not let her sit still, and he nodded and did not argue. She stepped out into the storm for the second time that night, and this time the child in her coat made her slower and clumsier, and the wind at her back drove her forward in staggering bursts that were almost worse than walking into it. The lantern threw a small yellow circle around her boots. Beyond that circle, there was nothing at all. She kept the fence line on her left hand by feel, brushing her mitten against the top rail every few steps to be sure it was still there, and when the fence ended, she counted paces and turned north by the wind on her cheek, and she prayed as she walked, without words, only the shape of a prayer, and the shape of it was Peter's name. She lost the fence line twice. The first time she found it again within a minute, by dropping to one knee and sweeping her mitten in a slow arc through the snow until she struck the frozen wood. The second time she was longer finding it, and when at last her hand met the post, she stayed kneeling with her forehead pressed against it for a full count of 10 before she could bring herself to stand up again. Peter had gone very quiet inside her coat. She could feel him breathing, shallow and quick, but he had stopped even the small whimpering he had made at the start. The lane bent north around the ridge, and the wind eased a little in the lee of it, and she pushed forward faster, though her legs by then had begun to feel like something that belonged to another woman. She could no longer feel her feet inside her boots. Her cheeks below the muffler had gone from burning to numb to something worse than numb, a thick woolen absence where her face used to be. She thought once, quite clearly, that if she fell now she would not get up, and she made herself think about Peter's weight against her chest instead, and she kept walking. She smelled the smoke before she saw the light. It was the thin, sweet smell of a hearth fire burning low, drifting downwind from somewhere ahead of her, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever smelled in her life. She lifted the lantern and saw, perhaps 40 yards ahead through the driving snow, the small, square yellow shape of a lit window. She could not run. Her legs would not run. But she went at the fastest walk her body would give her, and she reached the door of the cabin, and she did not knock at first because she had forgotten how to make her arm rise. She stood there swaying, and then she lifted her mitten and struck the door once, twice, 3 times. The door opened. Sarah Whitfield stood in the lamplight in a shawl over her nightdress with her hair loose down her back, and for one long strange moment the two women only looked at each other across the threshold. Charlotte tried to speak and could not. Then Sarah's eyes went to the small bulge inside Charlotte's coat, and she stepped forward and took Charlotte by both arms and pulled her inside, and she closed the door against the wind with her shoulder, and the storm was gone. It was gone. That was the thing Charlotte could never afterward describe to anyone who had not been there. She had stepped from a world where the wind was screaming into a room where the wind was a distant murmur far away, and the air on her frozen face was warm, and a small hearth fire burned low in the fireplace across the room, and the lamp on the table was steady, and the thermometer beside the door read 61 degrees. Sarah was already unbuttoning Charlotte's coat. She took Peter out of it with hands that moved quickly and without any fuss, and she laid him on the rag rug in front of the hearth and began pulling off his boots and his stockings. And Charlotte saw, for the first time in the lamplight, that the child's feet were the color of old candle wax, and that Sarah's face, when she looked at them, went very still. "Fetch me the basin," Sarah said quietly. It was not to Charlotte she spoke. Thomas was already out of bed and moving, a boy of 9 in a nightshirt, and he brought the basin and the pitcher without a word. Sarah warmed the water on the hearth and tested it against the inside of her own wrist before she lowered Peter's feet into it, and she watched the boy's face as she did, and when he flinched and drew a sharp breath and began to cry, she let out a long, slow breath of her own and said, more to herself than to Charlotte, that crying was good. Crying meant the feeling was coming back. A child whose feet went into warm water and did not cry was a child in serious trouble. This one would keep his toes. Charlotte sat on the bench by the table and could not stop shaking. Sarah brought her a cup of coffee from the pot at the edge of the coals, and she wrapped a quilt around Charlotte's shoulders, and she did all of it without a single word about the mercantile, or the tavern, or the laughter at the church door in October. Charlotte watched her move about the room, and Charlotte began, quietly, to cry. Sarah looked up once from Peter's feet and met Charlotte's eyes across the room, and what passed between them then was neither forgiveness exactly nor apology exactly, but something that stood in the place of both and served for both. And after that, Sarah went back to her work and Charlotte drank her coffee and the storm went on outside without them. They stayed 3 days. When the wind fell at last on the second morning, other refugees began to arrive on foot from the town, and by the second night there were 9 people sleeping on the floor of the little cabin, and the thermometer still held above 50. Sarah fed them from her own stores without complaint, and Thomas gave up his bed to the Bergstrom children, and Ruth passed her rag doll to the smallest of them without being asked. The stories they brought with them were bad. The parsonage roof had gone. The Ellis family had walked out through a broken window when their stove failed and had reached the church only because the reverend had come out with a rope. 2 of the older men in town, both widowers who had lived alone, were dead in their beds. The livestock losses would not be known for weeks. When the roads opened, the men of Willow Creek came out to the Whitfield place one by one, and they stood in the yard with their hats in their hands and they asked Sarah how she had done it. She showed them. She showed them the letter from Hands, and she read the parts they could not read, and she took a pry bar to a section of the north wall so they could see the packed straw behind the planks. Halloran came. He stood in the doorway a long time and did not go inside, and when he left he did not speak, but a week later a wagon arrived at Sarah's gate with a new cast-iron stove on it and a note that said only, "Paid in full. E. Halloran." By spring, 4 other cabins in the valley had been rebuilt on Sarah's plan, and by the following autumn 11 had, and the technique spread from Willow Creek along the wagon roads east and west, and a schoolteacher in the next county wrote a short article about it for a farmer's monthly, and the article was reprinted and reprinted again. It would be more than 40 years before an agricultural journal in Lincoln, Nebraska, formally described the method under the name it carries today. Sarah Whitfield did not live to read that article, but her cabin stood, and her children grew up warm in it, and the town that had laughed at her in October came to her in January and did not laugh again.